Great British Manufacturing Podcast, brought to you by MTD, MFG and Jefferson.
Happy New Year and welcome to Series 2 of the Great British Manufacturing Podcast. My name is Joe Reynolds and welcome to the show. This series, we've slightly refined the format, and whilst we'll still be covering the positive industry news, we plan to dedicate more time covering the topics that matter most to our sector, also interviewing special guests and showcasing manufacturers and their factories. We certainly have a very special guest this week, no other than the Business Secretary, Grant Shapps. But before we speak with Mr. Shapps, even though we are only in the second week of January, there's already lots of positive news. Welcome to my co-host, Stuart Whitehead. Tell us more, Stuart.
Morning, Joe. Happy New Year to you and everyone else. And like you say, 10, 14 days in, and we've got a raft of positive news items, including the following. So Teva, they're set to start mass production in its new factory in Tilbury after securing approval for its electric truck. The British firm expects to create hundreds of jobs at the Essex manufacturing plant. British Steel's new 54 million billet caster at its Scunthorpe site will be commissioned this spring, and that's part of a wider £230 million investment programme. JCB's £100 million hydrogen engine development programme is celebrating a major production milestone, having built the 50th engine. That's part of the development process. JCB is also recruiting 150 apprentices this year. And more good news on the apprenticeship front. BAE Systems, they're going to be recruiting 2,600 apprentices and graduates this year, a 43% increase on last year's intake. Jaguar Land Rover, they're planning to recruit 300 apprentices across the UK this year. And in total, more than 800 young people will join JLR's Early Careers programme, a record intake for Britain's biggest car maker. Continuing the automotive theme, Bentley Motors, they've recorded the highest sales in its 104-year history. British Mark, which is investing £2.5 billion transforming its Crewe plant, sold 15,174 cars across the world last year. Rolls-Royce Motor Cars in Goodwood, they've also achieved their highest ever annual sales last year, delivering more than 6,000 cars. And finally, the Nissan Qashqai is the first British-built model to top the UK's annual sales charts for a quarter of a century, after 42,704 new Sunderland-built Qashqais were bought last year.
Stuart, not a bad start to the year, is it? January is normally quite a quiet month for positive UK manufacturing news, but not 2023.
No, fantastic. Hopefully more and better things to come as well, Joe.
Indeed. And at this time, I'd like to introduce the guest on this week's podcast, who is no other than Grant Shapps, the Business Secretary. Mr. Shapps, a very warm welcome to the podcast and many thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here.
To start with, please can you explain to our listeners your professional background and your current role and responsibilities, please?
Yes, of course. Well, I guess it's not unfair to say that I'm obviously a politician, and that's how I became Secretary of State for Business, Energy, Climate, Industrial Strategy and Research and Development in the science areas. So covers a wide range of areas. But before that, I'd been Transport Secretary, and prior to that, I'd been in the Foreign Office, Development, and several other jobs before that, Party Chairman, Housing Minister. So I've done a lot of different jobs in government. But prior to all of that was actually in business. I started a printing company, which amazingly still goes, though without my input to this day. So that's my background, and it's sort of business and then politics.
Wonderful. And we understand you're in the Middle East at the moment, and you've got some positive news for the British manufacturing sector. Please, can you elaborate on this?
Yes, that's right. I'm in Abu Dhabi. Yesterday, I was in Saudi, in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. And I've been here signing agreements with the two governments on sort of British manufacturing, engineering, and particular things to do with the energy swap, the transition, as it's called, to energy, which is going to be much less damaging and indeed solve some of those problems to do with climate change. So a big push on sort of British enterprise and unlocking the door, both to investing here in the Middle East and vice versa, bringing inward investment from places like the Emirates, the UAE, where I am at the moment, into the UK, and we've already seen billions of pounds invested. We're working on getting tens of billions, potentially more.
Yeah, fantastic news. Morning, Mr. Shapps. It's Stuart White. Thanks for joining us. And moving on, we've asked some of our listeners for questions for you. One being, what are your plans for a strong and comprehensive industrial strategy for the manufacturing industry?
Yeah, so hi, Stuart. So look, I mean, first of all, I think manufacturing is hugely important to the British economy, and actually, I think we've reached a point where advanced manufacturing, in particular, is really important. If you look at where we can succeed in the world, I think it's in those areas where perhaps it's because we've got the science and technology base, the expertise, the engineering specialisms to do things that others may not be able to do. That might be because we're using new materials. And this morning I've been at the university here in Abu Dhabi looking at the way the graphene is being developed. It's a new material, so-called 2D material, that will have massive implications. It's already starting to in lots of areas of manufacturing. And Britain's really got the lead. It's invented in the UK, discovered in Manchester. I was having conversations about how that gets commercialized and what products it would end up going into. It can be anything from helping amazingly with water desalinization, so to make water safe, through to making the aircraft wings lighter and concrete without water and many other applications. So I mean, I think Britain's manufacturing future is actually very bright. It does mean that we'll need to be kind of taking our first mover advantage, I think, from the science sector often, to convert that into things that we can do and do them before the rest of the world get there, and then actually sell and manufacture and sell it to the rest of the world.
No, absolutely. And I mean, moving on, I don't know whether you've seen, but over the last few months, there's been a petition and a campaign really calling for the appointment of a dedicated minister for manufacturing, led by a lady called Andrea, a friend of the podcast. And this is really to give SMEs a stronger voice in government. I don't know what. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Well, it's actually essentially we've got that. Interestingly, this is the first time I can remember where both the Secretary of State for Business, that's me, and also the Secretary for SMEs, the Minister for SMEs, I should say, really. Both of us come from business backgrounds, so we've both got that fundamental understanding. Now, I suppose printing is only it's partly service and it's partly manufacturing as a business, but it does mean that I do have at least some insight into what it's like to do business, what it's like to be an SME, and so does the Small Business Minister. So you have, if you are listening to this and you are in a manufacturing business, I think representation around the cabinet table, such that hasn't existed for very, very many years, banging the drum, as I always do for British business, and manufacturing in particular, which is a subject close to my heart.
No, fantastic to hear, and I'm sure Andrea and others will be very pleased to hear that. And there's been the last 12 months, 18 months, and we've covered it on the podcast and our MTDCNC news channels. There's been a huge array of inward investment into the UK, and a lot of that has been based around the green economy. And I mean, what do you see as economic opportunities for the manufacturing sector through decarbonisation and the UK's net zero strategies?
So I think it's immense, actually. As I mentioned, I'm here in Abu Dhabi. I've just been meeting with the folks here responsible for a £10 billion investment, of which there are about £6 billion through. A lot of that is in some of the sort of life sciences, advanced manufacturing, but also particularly in clean technology, clean energy technology. So anything from those vast wind farms that are being constructed out in the North Sea, and the UK. People may not realise this. It took me by surprise when I first heard it. We now have not only the world's biggest wind farm in the North Sea, we also have in the United Kingdom the world's second, third, and fourth biggest wind farms. So we have, real speciality in a very big new manufacturing area of the economy that 10 or 15 years ago simply didn't exist. That's the scale of it. On a good day now, half of our electricity will be generated by wind power, when the wind's blowing, of course. But there are other technologies as well. I think our opportunity to be that sort of manufacturing superpower when it comes to green renewable energy, for example, is almost endless. And one of the things I'm keen to do is to expand the British expertise and sell that British expertise, both the manufacturing but also the consultancy, because we've had the experience. And I'd like to see more of the manufacturing take place in the UK because I think as the industry got started, partly through necessity, a lot of it was brought in. And now we're starting to see much more of that manufacturing take place in the UK, and that means that SMEs and the whole of the supply chain gets involved.
And I've got another question, really. As a business, MTD, we visit approximately 50 SMEs per month for various reasons, video production and other things. And they're all saying the same thing. And you probably know what's coming here, but they've got challenges and concerns in the manufacturing sector around energy costs and obviously inflation. Particularly for small and medium enterprises, really. A good friend of the podcast, SDE Technologies, is an example. Shropshire-based SME leading company. Their electric bill's risen from 250,000 to 750,000. They're not sure if they qualify for any help, any relief, and obviously that's huge. What plans are in place?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Putin's illegal war in Ukraine has caused this enormous energy price hike, and it has hit everybody, whether that's consuming domestically at home or indeed businesses. Just to answer the question directly, that company does qualify for relief and indeed has had relief. You don't have to apply for that business relief. But the business, I'm not talking about the domestic bill, I'm talking about business bills, have been subsidised through this energy spike to the tune of £18 billion, £18 billion. I suppose the message is, although this may not be much comfort, it would have been one heck of a lot worse had, as a government, we're not taking the decision to fund £18 billion into supporting them. But we've got a situation now where a couple of things are happening. First of all, we're seeing the wholesale gas price back down below where it was before Ukraine was invaded. So that's a positive development. But secondly, because we recognise that quite a lot of firms will be stuck on perhaps contracts for energy that they maybe have re-signed during, or had to essentially sign back if they didn't have a fixed contract over this last year, during this period, that could then remain high. Actually, so just last week, my colleague, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, announced up to a further £5.5 billion to run from next April, again to help, particularly in the most extreme cases. I want to say none of this is absolute, to your Shropshire business colleagues and anywhere else, this doesn't solve the problem. We have a problem with globally high energy prices. Part of the reason why I'm out in the Middle East, in the Gulf states right now, is to try to help ensure that we do have sufficient supply of energy in the short term, but also the technology, the renewable energies, which are clearly much more sustainable for us in the longer term. So it is for that reason. But this doesn't mean that there aren't still challenges, but the government has stepped up with a lot of taxpayers' cash to try to help. And I really hope now that we see these prices continue as we've seen to moderate, and that your colleagues' energy bills start to drop as a result.
Sure, and the other thing they're mentioning, when it does has to stop, don't just stop it, almost tear it down, ratchet it down, like almost like the furlough scheme did, where it didn't just stop overnight, it ratcheted down. Is that something you're considering?
Yeah, in fact, it's something we said we're going to do. So March was the current scheme runs till March. After March, that's the £18 billion scheme. After March, the scheme that's just been announced is to do that wind down. So that's exactly what we're putting in place.
Okay. And finally, what are your aspirations for the sector? I know you've touched on it already, but what are your aspirations for the sector here in the UK, both this year and further beyond?
Well, I'd like to see the sector grow. I think it's enormously valuable for the British economy for all sorts of reasons, actually, in terms of people's job prospects, obviously, for the economy as a whole, but also because manufacturing, I think, is valuable in itself. It occupies a special place in people's hearts, in a sense, because it involves a bunch of skills which aren't necessarily available in other parts of the economy, in service parts of the economy, for example. Often, of course, as I mentioned with my own printing business, I used to ponder whether that was a manufacturing business. We did, after all, manufacture print, or was it a service business? And the answer was, of course, it was both. And I think a lot of businesses are like that. A lot of manufacturing businesses do both. In fact, it's almost impossible not to do a bit of both, of course. I think that, as I was saying right at the top, Britain has an enormous number of specialities and strengths. Our educational base, having 7 of the 20 best universities in the world, for example, gives us great sort of technological edge. Often we're not brilliant at taking those new developments, which might be in manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and turning them into commercial opportunities. So one of the things I'm really keen to do as business secretary is scale up the opportunities that we have. I'd like to see scale up Britain when it comes to manufacturing, able to get us to the next level and export not just around Europe but around the world as well. So those would be my, if I off the top of my head, those would be the things I want to see happen. I meet very regularly with Make UK and others who are involved in the manufacturing sphere. I'm always very interested to hear what they have to say. I think they would identify energy. I think they would identify skills. And I think they would identify finance, to name but 3 things off the top of my head. And those are the areas I'm therefore concentrating on.
Marvellous. And just one final thing. Obviously, we've been one of the world leaders in the automotive sector, both on mass production and also niche vehicle manufacture. Obviously, we're going through this transition, predominantly EVs at the moment. If we don't act really fast and we lose any of that business, there's a good chance it won't be reshored, because just the nature of those factories. What the government currently doing, if anything, to help the transition to EVs?
That's right. I'm in touch with all of the vehicle manufacturers. And as you say, there's a surprising number. There's probably 15 or so, relatively large. Not necessarily because they produce large numbers, but sometimes just because the value of each vehicle is very large. And in other cases, because it's mass production, like, say, a Nissan. And I'm in touch with all of these firms, really working towards making that transition. I was responsible for setting the overall policy of transitioning to zero carbon, and doing it a touch ahead of others, actually, so that investment decisions as they're made for the world, actually, if you're a car manufacturer, you might as well make that investment in the UK, because you know that the policy is going to support it, and therefore we get to export it, which is what we do with, I think, actually the majority of cars that we manufacture. So there's lots of government help, including through the Automotive Transformation Fund and assistance otherwise with things like setting up gigafactories. But it's not just the factories, it's the supply chain. So just recently I was up in Teesside where a lithium refinery, so a green lithium refinery is being set up. Actually not one, but 2 of them. Just one of them alone will supply about 8% of Europe's lithium requirements, mainly for car batteries. And that's only been possible because we've used freedoms that we have outside of the EU to write our own legislation as regards the safety measures required to deal with lithium refineries. It's given us a massive head start. So I think we can use these freedoms in order to make sure that we have the supply chain in place as we transition to this new greener EV-based car manufacturing.
Sure. And if you got Elon Musk on speed dial, there's a big field waiting for him in Somerset, should he want it.
Well, I don't want to reveal too much, but there are quite a number of people who are in competition for that particular field in Somerset. So we'll watch the space, I guess, or watch that space.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Shapps. We appreciate your time and know you're busy man out there, and keep doing what you're doing. And please do look after manufacturing, because we do need your help. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Stuart, great to hear from the business secretary, wasn't it? Quite an insightful interview, really. I'll be interested to learn what SMEs think of the interview. It's basically saying they have a voice. Speak up, and that he's doing his best.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get feedback, from the interview, and Mr. Shapps has been in the position a relatively short period of time, so we've got to allow him to prove what he's going to be doing for the sector. All very, very positive this morning, and I'm sure all the plans and so forth will come to fruition.
Yeah, absolutely. Stuart, thank you for coming on the podcast, the first of the new year, the first of the new series. Mr. Shapps, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you on the podcast. Look forward to having you back on soon. But as always, the biggest thank you is to you guys at home for taking your time to listen to our podcast. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Great British Manufacturing Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating and a review. You can find us on Twitter using @MTDMFG and @Jefferson_MFG.